You are a 7-year-old boy playing in your Christian village in the Balkans. When Ottoman officials stand at your door, they are not there for taxes or tributes. They are there for you, and you will never see your family again. The Ottoman Empire lasted over 6 centuries, spanned 3 continents, and controlled the fates of millions of people. We remember its magnificent architecture, powerful sultans, and strategic brilliance. But behind the golden facades of palaces and the glory of conquests lay sexual practices so disturbing that even contemporary observers struggled to document them. These were not isolated incidents or cultural misunderstandings. They were systematic strategies that turned human sexuality into a tool of control, exploitation, and terror. What you are about to discover comes from Ottoman administrative records, eyewitness accounts from diplomats and travelers, and archaeological findings that reveal how an empire weaponized the most intimate aspects of human experience. The practices we will examine were not exceptions. They were institutional policies that shaped the lives of millions of people over centuries. The most horrifying aspect is not just what happened, but how methodically it was organized. The Ottomans kept meticulous records of everything, including the systematic exploitation of children, the operation of forced castration centers, and the administration of sexual slavery on an industrial scale. These documents still exist today, archived and waiting for historians brave enough to confront them. Before we proceed, if you're interested in dark and forgotten history, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. It helps us a lot to produce more videos like this. Now back to the video. Let's begin with perhaps the most psychologically devastating practice of all, the devshirme system, also known as the child levy or blood tax. Every few years, Ottoman officials swept through Christian villages in the Balkans conducting what was called the collection. But they weren't collecting taxes or goods, they were collecting children. The process was terrifyingly efficient. The officials arrived with detailed records that meticulously documented how many Christian families lived in the village, how many boys of the right age were available, and when the village had last contributed to the levy. They kept tables of human suffering, tracking children like livestock across the entire empire. Boys between 7 and 20 years old were the primary targets, though the preferred age range was much younger. Some records show children as young as 4 being torn from their mothers by officials who viewed their tears as merely a cost of imperial administration. The selection process was methodical and cruel. The officials examined each boy as if they were buying horses, checking their health, intelligence, and physical development. But what makes this practice particularly horrific is this: these children were not sent to mines or fields to die. They were taken to serve the empire in the most intimate ways. The brightest and most attractive boys were brought to the palace, where they converted to Islam, received new names, and were trained to fulfill the personal needs of the sultan. The process wasn't just about acquiring servants. It was about complete psychological reprogramming. The children were immediately separated from anyone who spoke their language. They were forbidden from using their birth names or speaking about their families. Any connection to their past lives was beaten out of them. Within months, most couldn't even remember their original names. They were turned into blank slates onto which the empire could write any identity that served its purposes. Many of these boys were destined for the Janissary Corps, the empire's elite military unit. But even this seemingly honorable fate had a dark twist. Janissaries were required to remain celibate and completely devoted to the sultan. Their only intimate relationships were with each other, creating a military culture where homosexual relationships were not only tolerated, but institutionalized. The empire even created a special military unit, the so-called Çavuş Battalion, to manage these relationships. This was not an informal arrangement. It was an official military formation with its own command structure, regulations, and purpose. The battalion existed specifically to channel and control homoerotic relationships within the Janissary Corps, ensuring that sexual tensions did not disrupt military discipline. Historical accounts describe in disturbing detail how this battalion operated. Members held privileged positions and access to resources denied to other soldiers. They were essentially professional partners for higher-ranking officers, their military service inseparable from their sexual availability. The empire had created a system where military advancement could depend on sexual submission to superiors. But the devshirme system had an even darker purpose. The most attractive boys, deemed too beautiful for military service, were chosen for an entirely different fate. These children were destined for the private chambers of the palace, where they served the sultan and his courtiers in ways that defy modern comprehension. Some of these boys were castrated to become eunuchs. The process was brutal and often deadly. Most castrations were performed in Egypt or Ethiopia, where Islamic law's prohibition on the practice was circumvented by having Christians or Jews carry out the operations. The mortality rate was staggering. Historical accounts suggest that only 10% of castrated boys survived the procedure. Consider that for a moment the empire was so determined to acquire eunuchs that it was willing to kill 9 out of 10 boys to get one survivor. The survivors faced a fate that many considered worse than death. African boys were typically fully emasculated and became so-called black eunuchs, considered more trustworthy around the sultan's women and often rising to influential positions within the palace hierarchy. European boys from the Balkans usually had only their testicles removed and became white eunuchs, primarily serving in administrative roles. The psychological impact on these children was immeasurable. They were not only physically mutilated but completely cut off from the possibility of normal human relationships. They could never marry, never have children, never experience sexual intimacy as nature intended. They existed solely to serve an empire that had stolen everything from them, including their fundamental humanity. But castration was not the only fate awaiting beautiful boys in the Ottoman system. Some were chosen as köçek dancers, young male dancers, who dressed as women and performed at festivals and celebrations. These boys occupied a disturbing space between genders, neither fully male nor female, in the eyes of Ottoman society. The audiences at these performances were notorious for their violent behavior. Historical accounts describe how men became so aroused by the young dancers that they fought each other for the chance to sexually abuse them. Glasses were smashed, voices lost to shouting, and sometimes people were killed in the chaos surrounding these performances. The dancers themselves had no protection from this violence. They were expected to submit to all advances, their bodies treated as entertainment for drunken and aggressive men. The practice became so associated with sexual violence that it was eventually suppressed, but only after generations of boys had been subjected to this systematic abuse. Perhaps the most disturbing practice was one known as the tavşançıl system. The term roughly translates to rabbit boys, a euphemism that barely conceals the horrific reality. These were young Christian boys, typically Greeks or other Europeans, specifically brought to the palace to sexually satisfy high-ranking officials. Unlike other forms of palace service, the tavşançıl system operated in complete secrecy. These boys had no official status, no legal protections, no hope of advancement or eventual freedom. They existed solely as sexual objects for the pleasure of their masters, hidden from public view in historical records. The system was deliberately kept small and secret, but its existence reveals something critical about Ottoman sexual practices. This was not about cultural differences or differing moral standards. It was about the systematic sexual exploitation of children organized and sustained by the highest levels of government. The boys taken into this system faced a reality that defied all natural human bonds. Parents received no word about their children's fates, no letters, no visits, nothing but the endless silence of loss. Some families waited decades for sons who would never return, hoping their children still thought of home, somewhere in the vast Ottoman territories. The empire's records show the calculated cruelty of this separation. Officials deliberately relocated children as far as possible from their home regions, ensuring that even an escaped boy could never find his way back to his village. The language barriers were insurmountable. A boy from a Serbian village might find himself in Constantinople surrounded by people speaking Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, his mother tongue a useless relic of a past he was not allowed to acknowledge. But the psychological destruction went deeper than mere separation. The conversion process was designed to erase not just religious identity, but cultural memory itself. The boys were given new names that bore no resemblance to their birth names. They were taught that their former lives were ones of ignorance and sin, that their families were infidels who deserved conquest. They were forced to participate in rituals that mocked their previous faith, sometimes even required to spit on crosses or burn Christian texts. The most psychologically devastating aspect was how the system turned victims into perpetrators. Boys who survived the initial trauma and adapted to palace life often became the ones who selected the next generation of victims. They returned as adults to the Balkans, pointing out the most attractive children in villages like the ones they once called home. The empire had perfected a cycle of trauma that ensured its own perpetuation. Beyond the child levy system, another layer of Ottoman sexual exploitation operated on an even larger scale. The empire's approach to female sexuality created a marketplace for human flesh that surpassed anything seen in the world at the time. This was not just about concubinage or marriage customs. It was about the systematic commercialization of women's bodies on an industrial scale. The slave markets of Constantinople operated with the efficiency of modern corporations. Women were categorized, graded, and sold according to a complex hierarchy that reduced humans to mere commodities. African women fetched different prices than European women. Virgins were worth more than non-virgins. Young girls commanded higher prices than mature women. The empire had created detailed price structures for human sexuality. The surviving documents reveal the cold mathematics of this trade. A typical African girl might be sold for 1,500 to 2,500 kurush if intended for domestic work. But if destined for sexual use, the price could double or triple. European women, especially from Greece or the Balkans, fetched even higher prices. Some sold for amounts equivalent to small fortunes. The most expensive category was reserved for so-called odalisques, women specifically trained for sexual service in the imperial harems. These women could be sold for tens of thousands of kurush, their value determined by beauty training and perceived fertility. The empire maintained training facilities where captive women were schooled in the arts of seduction, massage, and sexual performance, transforming traumatized prisoners into polished commodities. But the numbers tell only part of the story. Behind every transaction was a human being torn from their family, stripped of their identity, and reduced to a sexual object for the buyer's pleasure. The empire's legal system offered these women no protections. A man could sexually use his slaves without legal consequences. If a slave became pregnant, her children belonged exclusively to her master, who could sell, kill, or use them as he pleased. The scale of this trade was staggering. Constantinople alone housed hundreds of thousands of enslaved women at any given time. The empire's expansion into Africa, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe was partly driven by the insatiable demand for new women. Military campaigns were planned not only for territorial gain, but also for human acquisition, with commanders calculating how many women they could expect from each conquest. The treatment of these women within the harems reveals another dimension of Ottoman sexual cruelty. The popular image of harems as luxurious spaces filled with pampered concubines bears no resemblance to historical reality. Most harem women lived in constant fear, desperately competing for the attention that might elevate them from mere slaves to favored concubines. The competition was deliberately fostered by the system. Women were pitted against each other in elaborate displays meant to entertain their masters. They were forced to perform increasingly degrading acts to stand out from their rivals. Those who failed to please faced punishments ranging from beatings to starvation to outright execution. The psychological warfare within these spaces was as systematic as any military campaign. Women were encouraged to denounce each other, sabotage rivals, and form temporary alliances that could be broken at any moment. The empire had created environments where the natural bonds between women were turned into weapons of mutual destruction. Perhaps the most disturbing was the fate of children born in this system. The empire's records show that infanticide was commonplace, particularly for children of African mothers. The mixed-race children of these unions were often killed immediately after birth, their existence viewed as inconvenient complications in the machinery of sexual exploitation. Contemporary observers noted the absence of mixed-race children in Constantinople, despite the obvious presence of thousands of African women in sexual relationships with Turkish men. The conclusion was inescapable. These children were systematically eliminated to maintain the racial hierarchies the empire deemed essential to its social order. Women who survived long enough to age out of sexual desirability faced fates often worse than death. They might be sold to brothels, cast out onto the streets, or simply killed to make way for younger replacements. The empire had no pension system for retired concubines, no retirement plan for women who had spent their youth serving imperial pleasure. The legal framework supporting this system shows how deeply sexual exploitation was embedded in Ottoman governance. Laws explicitly stated that raping a free woman carried the death penalty, while raping a slave incurred only a fine comparable to damaging property. The empire had created a two-tiered system of human value that made systematic sexual violence not only legal, but economically rational. The systematic nature of these practices becomes even more horrifying when we examine how the empire institutionalized sexual violence as entertainment. Public executions were not just punishments. They were spectacles where sexual humiliation was the main attraction. Criminals convicted of sexual offenses faced punishments designed to mirror their crimes in the most degrading ways. But the empire went further, turning these executions into festivals where crowds gathered to watch elaborate displays of sexual torture. The audience didn't just watch passively, they participated, shouting suggestions, betting on how long victims would survive, and treating human suffering like a sport. The empire's approach to justice revealed a society that had fully normalized sexual violence. Rape was not just a crime to be punished. It was a tool of statecraft, a method of demonstrating power, a form of entertainment for the masses. The legal codes didn't just permit this violence, they regulated it, creating detailed procedures for how sexual torture should be conducted to maximize both suffering and spectacle. Archaeological findings from execution sites support these horrific accounts. Excavations have uncovered remains showing systematic mutilations that went far beyond mere killing. Bodies were desecrated in ways that suggest prolonged torture specifically designed to destroy the sexual identity of victims before ending their lives. The empire had perfected the art of using sexuality as a weapon of ultimate humiliation. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Ottoman sexual practices was how they created a culture where this exploitation seemed normal. Children grew up in a society where human trafficking was visible on every street corner. Young people learned that bodies could be bought and sold like any other commodity. Entire generations were raised to see sexual violence not as aberrant behavior, but as the natural order of things. The empire's education system reinforced these attitudes through religious instruction that portrayed sexual slavery as divinely sanctioned. Children were taught that enslaving infidels was a religious duty, that using their bodies was a reward for the faithful, and that resisting these practices was resisting God himself. The systematic indoctrination ensured that each generation perpetuated the same cycles of abuse that had traumatized their parents. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate victims. Families lived in constant fear that their children might be taken. Parents mutilated their own sons and daughters, disfiguring faces or breaking limbs to make them less desirable to Ottoman collectors. The empire had created a society where loving parents were forced to harm their children to protect them from worse fates. The economic incentives underlying these practices show how deeply sexual exploitation was embedded in the empire's foundations. The slave trade was not a side business. It was a pillar of imperial finances, generating revenue that funded military expansion, palace construction, and administrative operations. The empire's budget depended on the systematic destruction of human dignity across 3 continents. Trade routes were specifically established to facilitate human trafficking. Diplomatic agreements included clauses regulating the exchange of slaves. Military strategies factored in calculations of how many humans could be captured and sold. The empire had created an entire infrastructure dedicated to the commercialization of human sexuality. The documentation of these practices exists in disturbing detail because the Ottomans were meticulous record keepers. They kept registers tracking the age, origin, and prices of enslaved people. They maintained inventories of palace harems listing women like furniture or livestock. They preserved correspondences between officials discussing the sexual preferences of their superiors and how to satisfy them through strategic procurement. These records still exist today in archives in Turkey, providing undeniable evidence of systematic sexual exploitation conducted over centuries. The empire's own bureaucrats documented their crimes with the same care they devoted to tax collection or military planning. They saw nothing shameful in their actions because they lived in a society that had fully normalized the sexual exploitation of vulnerable populations. The international response to these practices shows how thoroughly the Ottoman system corrupted diplomatic relations. Foreign ambassadors wrote detailed reports about the sexual horrors they witnessed, but framed them as cultural differences, not human rights violations. European powers that could have intervened were too busy profiting from Ottoman trade routes to risk diplomatic incidents over the fate of enslaved children and women. The empire's influence spread these practices far beyond its borders. Ottoman sexual customs were adopted by client states and trading partners who saw them as sophisticated approaches to population control. The systematic exploitation of sexuality became a model that other powers emulated, spreading the empire's particular brand of sexual violence across the known world. As the Ottoman Empire began to collapse in the 19th and 20th centuries, these practices didn't simply disappear. They evolved, adapted, and found new expressions. The infrastructure of sexual exploitation operated over centuries left deep cultural scars that persisted long after the empire's collapse. The most tragic aspect of this entire system was how it destroyed the possibility of normal human relationships for millions of people across generations. Children who survived sexual trauma grew up unable to form healthy bonds with others. Women who escaped slavery carried psychological wounds that never healed. Men who participated in these systems of exploitation lost the capacity for genuine intimacy or empathy. The sexual practices of the Ottoman Empire represent one of history's most systematic examples of how power can corrupt every aspect of human experience. These were not isolated incidents or cultural misunderstandings. They were deliberate strategies designed to reduce humans to objects for the gratification of the powerful. The empire created an entire civilization built on the systematic destruction of human dignity. The consequences of this destruction echoed across centuries. Today, as we examine this dark chapter of human history, we are faced with uncomfortable questions about power exploitation and humanity's capacity to inflict suffering on others. The sexual practices of the Ottoman Empire remind us that civilization is far more fragile than we like to believe, and that the systematic dehumanization of vulnerable populations can be normalized with terrifying ease. The records wait in archives for historians brave enough to examine them. Archaeological evidence continues to emerge from excavation sites in former Ottoman territories. The genetic legacy of these practices can still be traced in population studies across 3 continents. History doesn't simply vanish because it makes us uncomfortable. Understanding these practices is not about condemning modern Turkey or Islam. It's about recognizing how power structures can corrupt human sexuality and turn intimate relationships into weapons of control. It's about commemorating the millions of victims whose suffering has been largely forgotten by history. And it's about remaining vigilant against the conditions that enable such systematic exploitation. The Ottoman Empire lasted over 6 centuries and controlled the lives of millions of people. Its approach to human sexuality shaped the experiences of countless generations and left scars that persist to this day. These were not ancient practices from a distant world. The last Ottoman sultan was deposed in 1922, within the lifetime of people still alive today. This history is closer than we think, and its lessons remain painfully relevant. The most terrifying aspect of the Ottoman sexual practices was not their brutality, though that was undoubtedly extreme. It was their systematic nature, their normalization, and their integration into every aspect of imperial governance. The empire had created a machine for the sexual exploitation of humans, and that machine operated with bureaucratic efficiency for hundreds of years. Understanding how such systems arise and persist is critical to preventing their return in new forms. Human dignity is non-negotiable. Regardless of power structures, cultural differences, or historical context, the sexual practices of the Ottoman Empire represent a complete abandonment of this principle. And the consequences were catastrophic for millions of people over centuries. Their stories deserve to be remembered, their suffering acknowledged, and their humanity restored through historical truth.